The sound of the Gion Shoja bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last to be no more than dust before the wind. In the waning years of the Heian period, when autumn leaves fell upon the royal capital like scattered prayers, Japan stood poised between two worlds. Within the vermilion corridors of the palace, nobles composed poetry, while their silk sleeves trailed through pools of moonlight. Beyond the capital's gates, a different breed of men sharpened their swords and spoke of honor, measured not in syllables, but in blood. For 3 centuries, the Fujiwara regents had ruled from behind the throne, like shadows puppeting a sovereign. Their authority flowed through marriage alliances and bureaucratic control, delicate as morning mist, yet seemingly eternal. Aristocratic ladies wrote their diaries on paper thin as butterfly wings, recording the precise shade of a lover's hunting robe or the melancholy sound of rain on temple eaves. Art flourished in this hothouse of refinement, but the roots of governance had grown shallow. The sovereign himself had become a figure of ritual rather than rule. Ceremonies marked his days. The changing of seasons, the appointment of officials whose real command lay elsewhere, the performance of rites that connected heaven to earth through his sacred person. Young rulers often abdicated to become monks, wielding influence from monastery cells, while their successors enacted the same elaborate charade of divine authority. Into this world of fading influence stepped a man whose ambitions would shatter the ancient order, like thunder splitting a summer sky. Taira no Kiyomori emerged from the warrior provinces, where pragmatism trumped poetry and survival demanded skills unknown in the perfumed chambers of aristocratic society. His family had served the throne for generations, but as guardians rather than rulers, swords rather than scholars. The Taira traced their lineage to Emperor Kamu, lending them royal blood diluted by centuries, yet still potent enough to command respect. Unlike the Fujiwara, who ruled through whispered influence and marriage politics, the Western clan built their strength on military might and provincial connections. They understood that in an age when bandits plagued the highways and rebellious monks burned temples, the man who controlled the swords would ultimately control the realm. The rise of this ambitious warrior began amid the chaos of succession disputes that would later be remembered as the Hogan and Heike rebellions. These conflicts erupted when the delicate balance between retired and reigning sovereigns collapsed into open warfare. Former Emperor Sutoku, bitter over his forced abdication, allied himself with powerful nobles who resented the current faction. The resulting struggle would prove that palace intrigue, when pushed to its limits, inevitably transformed into armed conflict. The Hogan Rebellion of 1156 shattered whatever remained of the old certainties. For the first time, the sacred precincts of the royal palace became a battlefield. Arrows flew where once only whispered poetry had travelled. The conflict forced every major family to choose sides, dividing fathers from sons and brothers, from brothers in ways that would echo through generations. Prince Mochihito's desperate call to arms had reached sympathetic ears throughout the provinces, but the response came in forms the aristocrats had never anticipated. When the Taira leader led his warriors into the capital, they brought with them the dust of country roads and the uncompromising logic of men accustomed to solving problems with steel. The Minamoto clan, traditional rivals of the Western warriors, found themselves on the losing side of a conflict that would reshape the balance of authority forever. Minamoto no Tamayoshi, patriarch of his proud clan, discovered that loyalty to the wrong cause could prove fatal, even for those of the highest birth. His own son, Yoshitomo, stood with the opposing faction, creating a tragedy that would haunt the Minamoto for generations. When victory came to the sovereign's forces supported by the Taira, it brought with it a terrible reckoning. Tamayoshi faced execution, and his death marked the beginning of a blood debt that would demand payment in full. Yet even this victory proved merely a prelude to greater upheaval. 3 years later, the Heiji rebellion erupted when Minamoto no Yoshitomo, despite his previous loyalty to the throne, found himself drawn into another conspiracy against the established order. The retired emperor Go Shirakawa's complex relationship with his son, the reigning emperor Nijo, created opportunities for ambitious men to exploit royal divisions. During a winter night in 1159, when snow muffled the sounds of conspiracy, Yoshitomo struck at the heart of sovereign authority. His forces seized the retired ruler's palace, holding Go Shirakawa captive while fire consumed the elegant buildings that had housed centuries of culture and refinement. The flames that devoured the Sanjo Palace illuminated more than architecture. They revealed the fragility of a civilization built on aesthetic perfection rather than military strength. But the Taira commander had learned the lessons of the previous conflict well. While Yoshitomo celebrated his apparent victory in the capital, the Western leader gathered his forces in the provinces, building an army that would dwarf anything the Minamoto could field. His counterattack came with the inexorable force of an avalanche, sweeping away Yoshitomo's supporters and forcing the Minamoto commander to flee toward the eastern provinces, where his family held traditional strongholds. The pursuit that followed would be remembered for its merciless efficiency. Yoshitomo's flight ended in betrayal and death at the hands of a retainer who chose reward over loyalty. His young sons faced execution or exile, with only the youngest, Yoritomo, spared through calculated mercy, a decision that would later prove more consequential than anyone could have imagined. With the Minamoto crushed and scattered, the Taira found themselves the sole military force capable of maintaining order in the realm. The aristocracy, having witnessed the consequences of armed rebellion, welcomed their protection even as they privately mourned the passing of their exclusive dominance. The warrior had become indispensable to the very system he would eventually transform. The ambitious leader understood that military victory alone could not secure lasting control. True dominance required integration into the existing system, not its destruction. He began the careful process of weaving his family's influence into the fabric of palace life, arranging marriages that would bind his clan to the royal bloodline, and accepting ranks that legitimized his authority within established structures. His daughter, Tokuko, became the consort of Emperor Takakura, a union that promised to place Taira blood on the throne. When she gave birth to a son who would become Emperor Antoku, the Western clan achieved something the Fujiwara had never managed: actual kinship with a reigning sovereign. The child represented the fusion of military strength with royal authority, a combination that seemed to guarantee dominance for generations to come. The transformation from provincial warrior to grandfather of an emperor required more than strategic marriages. The family systematically placed supporters in key governmental positions, creating a network of loyalty that extended from the palace to the most distant provinces. Traditional nobles found themselves sharing influence with men whose fathers had been considered barely civilized. Yet the new order brought undeniable benefits in terms of security and effective administration. Trade flourished under Taira protection, as merchants traveled roads cleared of bandits by warriors, who understood that prosperity strengthened their own position. The port of Fukuhara, under direct clan control, became a gateway for commerce with Song China, bringing exotic goods and new ideas that enriched the capital's already sophisticated culture. Wealth flowing from overseas trade provided resources for both military expansion and cultural patronage. This control of maritime commerce represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Japanese governance. Previous rulers had focused on agricultural taxation and land control, but the Western leader recognized that international trade offered opportunities for wealth accumulation that could transform the basis of political strength. Chinese merchants found in him a reliable partner who could guarantee safe passage and fair treatment in exchange for a share of the profits that flowed through Japanese ports. Yet success bred its own dangers. As the clan's dominance expanded, so did their leader's ambitions and his willingness to challenge traditional constraints on warrior authority. The subtle deference he had once shown to palace protocol gave way to increasingly bold assertions of independence. When Buddhist temples attempted to use their established privileges to oppose Taira policies, he responded with force that shocked those accustomed to religious institutions' immunity from secular interference. The confrontation with Mount Hiei's warrior monks epitomized the collision between old and new forms of authority. These Sohei had long used their spiritual status and military organization to influence political decisions descending from their mountain strongholds, to intimidate the aristocracy with displays of armed protest. The willingness to meet religious violence with secular force demonstrated that the age of unquestioned monastic privilege had ended. His decision to move the capital from Kyoto to Fukuhara in 1180 revealed the full extent of his transformation from servant to master of the realm. This unprecedented action abandoned 12 centuries of tradition, relocating the sacred center of Japanese civilization to serve Taira commercial and strategic interests. The sovereign himself became little more than a ceremonial captive in this grand design for reshaping the nation. The new capital at Fukuhara reflected a vision of Japan as a maritime nation, connected to the wider world through trade and cultural exchange. Chinese architectural influences appeared alongside traditional Japanese designs, creating a hybrid aesthetic that embodied the cosmopolitan ambitions of the ruling clan. Foreign merchants walked streets where nobles had once composed poetry about cherry blossoms, their presence a visible symbol of the revolution in values and priorities. Yet even as the Taira reached the pinnacle of worldly success, signs of future trouble began to accumulate, like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Their leaders' increasing arrogance alienated supporters, who had expected partnership rather than subjugation. The forced relocation of the capital created resentment among nobles whose ancestors had served at Kyoto for countless generations. Most ominously, scattered reports spoke of Minamoto survivors gathering strength in distant provinces, their hatred sharpened by years of exile and humiliation. The Buddhist concept of karma suggested that actions carried consequences that transcended individual lifetimes, creating patterns of cause and effect that no amount of worldly dominance could escape. The clan's rise had been built upon the destruction of rivals and the overthrow of ancient traditions, achievements that carried within them the seeds of future retribution. The wheel of fortune that had lifted them to unprecedented heights contained the same mechanism that would eventually bring them down. As the spring of 1181 approached, the Taira stood as the undisputed masters of Japan, their young sovereign wearing the crown, and their family controlling every lever of authority. Yet the very completeness of their victory contained the elements of its own undoing. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The bells of Gaion had begun to toll for the Western clan. though their leader remained deaf to their warning song. Power corrupts the soul like rust devours iron. What begins as righteous strength transforms into merciless tyranny, and the very virtues that elevate a man become the vices that destroy him. In the final years of his dominance, the master of the Western House would learn this bitter truth, as omens multiplied around him like autumn leaves falling from a dying tree. The man who had once shown calculated restraint now ruled with the arbitrary cruelty of one who believed himself beyond earthly judgment. His morning audiences became exercises in terror, where a misplaced word or insufficient deference could result in immediate banishment. Noble families found themselves exiled to remote provinces for the smallest perceived slights. A daughter's insufficiently elegant bow, a son's failure to praise military victories with adequate enthusiasm, or simply the misfortune of possessing lands the house desired. The palace corridors that had once echoed with poetry and gentle laughter now carried whispered conversations filled with fear. Courtiers who had spent their lives mastering the subtle arts of political survival discovered that all their accumulated wisdom meant nothing in the face of unpredictable rage. The elegant protocols that had governed aristocratic society for centuries crumbled beneath the weight of increasingly erratic commands issued by a man who saw enemies in every shadow. Lady Nijo, daughter of a distinguished family that traced its ancestry to the legendary minister Sugawara no Michizain, learned the new reality when her sire criticized the forced relocation to Fukuhara during what he believed was a private conversation. Within hours, mounted warriors surrounded their mansion, with orders to escort the entire family to exile in distant Tosa province. Her last glimpse of the capital was through the window of a crude ox cart, watching the familiar rooftops disappear behind mountains as her elderly parent wept silently beside her. Such scenes multiplied throughout the land as the aging leader's suspicions deepened with age. The forced relocation to Fukuhara had created a simmering resentment that permeated every level of the displaced nobility. Ancient families who traced their lineage to the legendary founders of the nation discovered themselves treated as unwelcome guests in their own country. The sacred ceremonies that connected heaven to earth through the sovereign's divine person were now performed in hastily constructed buildings that lacked the spiritual resonance of Kyoto's hallowed sites. The new capital itself reflected the cultural dislocation that defined this era of upheaval. Chinese architectural influences dominated the hastily constructed government buildings, their red pillars and curved roofs creating an aesthetic that felt foreign to aristocrats raised among Kyoto's understated elegance. Foreign merchants walked streets where court nobles had once composed poetry about cherry blossoms, their presence a visible symbol of the revolution, in values and priorities that had transformed Japan. Yet even as external opposition mounted, internal cracks began to appear within the house itself. The meteoric rise had created tensions between those who remembered their humble origins and younger members who had known only privilege and dominance. Veterans who recalled the desperate battles against the Minamoto found themselves arguing with their own sons about the necessity of continued vigilance against potential threats. Into this atmosphere of growing discord stepped a figure who embodied the family's better angels. The eldest son and heir apparent represented everything the patriarch might have become, had success not corrupted his judgment. Raised in the shadow of paternal ambitions, yet educated in the classical traditions of the aristocracy, he possessed both the warrior's pragmatism and the courtier's refinement. His tall frame carried itself with natural dignity, while his eyes reflected the depth of learning that came from years spent studying Chinese classics and Japanese poetry. The prince who bore the burden of succession understood what his elder seemed to have forgotten. that lasting authority required the consent of the governed, not merely their subjugation. During morning council meetings, when reports arrived of unrest in various provinces, the heir consistently advocated for negotiation over force. His voice carried the weight of genuine conviction when he argued that showing mercy to defeated enemies would strengthen rather than weaken their rule. A tree that bends with the wind survives the storm, he would tell the aging leader, quoting ancient wisdom that seemed increasingly forgotten in the harsh calculations of political dominance. The reed that stands rigid breaks, while the willow that yields continues to grow. Such counsel reflected not weakness, but the profound understanding that true strength lay in adaptability rather than stubborn adherence to failed policies. When monks from the great monasteries came to protest the confiscation of their lands, the prince received them with the courtesy their spiritual status deserved. He listened patiently to their grievances, acknowledged the validity of their concerns, and sought compromises that would address security needs without completely alienating the religious establishment. His approach stood in stark contrast to his parents' growing tendency to view any opposition as treason, requiring immediate and violent suppression. The heir apparent's chambers became an unofficial sanctuary for those seeking relief from the harsh policies emanating from the patriarch's inner circle. Displaced nobles found in him a sympathetic ear, while worried temple abbots discovered that their petitions received serious consideration rather than summary dismissal. Even Chinese merchants, concerned about the stability of trade relationships, learned that the prince understood the delicate balance required to maintain profitable international commerce. But the aging master had grown deaf to counsel, even from his most beloved son. Success had bred a dangerous confidence that bordered on hubris, transforming the careful strategist who had once overthrown the Minamoto into a despot who believed his own propaganda about divine favor. The man who had risen through cunning and patience now relied increasingly on intimidation and spectacle to maintain his grip on the nation. Their confrontations became legendary within palace circles for their intensity and their futility. The two men would argue for hours behind closed doors, their raised voices audible to servants who dared not acknowledge what they overheard. The heir would emerge from these sessions visibly exhausted, his usual composure replaced by the strained expression of a man watching his family march deliberately toward destruction. The final rupture between their approaches came with the escalating confrontation with the religious establishment. The warrior monks of Nara's great temples had grown increasingly bold in their opposition, viewing the new policies as a fundamental threat to the spiritual order that underpinned Japanese civilization. Their protests took the form of armed demonstrations that marched through the streets of the ancient religious capital, bearing sacred relics while demanding the restoration of monastic privileges. The sight of armed monks carrying the holy treasures of Todaiji and Kofukuji temples while chanting sutras of protection represented exactly the kind of challenge that the leader could no longer tolerate. These Sohei commanded respect throughout Japan for their spiritual authority, making them far more dangerous than ordinary political opponents. Their ability to frame resistance in religious terms threatened to transform local grievances into a holy war against the Western House. The prince pleaded desperately for a peaceful resolution, proposing a series of compromises that would address monastic concerns while preserving essential interests. He suggested returning some confiscated temple lands, providing compensation for damages already inflicted, and establishing formal protocols for resolving future disputes between religious and secular authorities. Such proposals reflected his deep understanding that the family could not long survive if they made enemies of both the aristocracy and the religious establishment simultaneously. His elders' response came with the crushing finality of an avalanche. Elite units received orders to march on Nara, with instructions to suppress the monastic rebellion through whatever means proved necessary. The armies that surrounded the great temple complexes of Todaiji and Kofukuji carried not only weapons, but also torches, their commanders having received explicit authorization to destroy any buildings used to shelter armed resistance. The burning of Nara on the 28th day of the 12th month of 1180 marked a point of no return in the conflict between secular and religious authority. The attack began before dawn, when forces broke through the temple gates and engaged the defending monks in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Sohei fought with the desperate courage of men defending their most sacred spaces, wielding their naginata with skill honed through years of martial training. But courage could not overcome overwhelming numbers. As the sun rose over the ancient religious capital, flames began to lick at the wooden structures that had housed spiritual treasures for centuries. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by winter winds that seemed to carry the very breath of destruction. Within hours, the massive complex of Todaiji Temple had become an inferno that could be seen from miles away. The great bronze Buddha, that colossal statue which had watched over the ancient capital for 4 centuries, became the most potent symbol of the destruction. Standing 16 meters tall and weighing over 500 tons, the figure had survived earthquakes, typhoons, and previous conflicts through its sheer massive presence. Yet even this monument to eternal compassion could not withstand the intensity of the flames that now surrounded it. Witnesses described the horror of watching the statue slowly deform as the bronze reached its melting point. The serene face that had offered comfort to countless pilgrims began to sag and distort, its features becoming a grotesque parody of the enlightened expression that artists had labored for years to perfect. The hands that had been raised in gestures of blessing folded inward as the metal flowed like water, creating an image of anguish that seemed to embody the suffering of all those who perished in the conflagration. The psychological impact of this destruction extended far beyond the immediate military victory. Religious temples throughout Japan had long served as centers of learning, repositories of classical culture, and sanctuaries for those seeking spiritual solace. The deliberate targeting of these institutions suggested a level of cultural vandalism that appalled even many supporters. Monks who had previously remained neutral in political disputes now viewed the Western House as enemies of the faith itself. Reports of the destruction spread throughout the land with the speed of wildfire, carried by traumatized survivors who had witnessed the unthinkable. In distant provinces, temple bells tolled in mourning for the lost treasures, while monks offered prayers for the souls of their slaughtered brothers. The warriors had achieved a military victory, but at the cost of transforming themselves into objects of religious horror. For the heir, the news of Nara's destruction arrived like a physical blow to his already fragile health. He had spent his entire adult life trying to moderate his parents' extremism, believing that patient counsel could eventually guide the family toward policies that would ensure lasting stability. The burning of the temples represented the complete failure of everything he had worked to achieve. The prince's response to this catastrophe revealed the depth of his spiritual sophistication and his understanding of karma's inexorable workings. He immediately ordered the construction of a private temple where he could perform rituals of atonement for his family's crimes against the religious faith. His own wealth funded the copying of sacred texts to replace those destroyed in the flames, while his personal intervention saved several displaced monks from persecution by hardliners. Yet even as the heir worked frantically to mitigate the spiritual damage caused by his parents' policies, his own body began to manifest the toll of psychological and moral stress. Those who attended him in private noted the grey pallor that had replaced his once healthy complexion, the tremor in his hands when he thought himself unobserved, and the way he would often stop mid-sentence to stare into the distance as if seeing visions invisible to others. The illness that would claim his life announced itself through symptoms that defied medical explanation. Palace physicians, summoned from throughout Japan to treat the prince, found themselves puzzled by a condition that seemed to consume him from within. His fever would spike without warning, bringing delirium in which he spoke of burning temples and melting Buddhas, while his waking hours brought weakness so profound that he could barely lift his head from his pillow. Religious monks who visited him during his final days whispered that they recognized the signs of karmic retribution manifesting in physical form. The sins of the elder, they suggested, had somehow transferred to the son who had tried so desperately to prevent them. Whether this interpretation possessed literal truth mattered less than its effect on a man already tormented by guilt over his inability to control his family's destructive trajectory. The prince's death in the 8th month of 1179 created a crisis that extended far beyond mere succession. The man who had served as a buffer between his parents' increasingly extreme policies and the growing opposition they generated would never again be available to diffuse situations that might otherwise erupt into open rebellion. His diplomatic skills, his reputation for fairness, and his deep understanding of both warrior and courtier cultures died with him, leaving the house bereft of its moral compass at the moment when such guidance was most desperately needed. The funeral procession that carried the heir to his final rest moved through streets lined with mourners who understood that they were witnessing more than the death of a prince. They were observing the end of moderation itself, the last barrier between the nation and the unchecked tyranny that would surely follow. Even the weather seemed to reflect the solemnity of the occasion, with heavy clouds obscuring the sun and a steady rain that felt like the tears of heaven itself. Among those who watched the funeral cortege pass was Prince Mochihito, son of the retired sovereign Go-Shirakawa. A man of considerable learning and deep religious conviction, he had observed the deteriorating political situation with growing alarm. The systematic elimination of checks on authority, combined with the increasingly erratic behavior of the Western leader, convinced him that only direct action could preserve the land from complete chaos. The prince possessed advantages that made him uniquely qualified to challenge the current dominance. His royal blood commanded automatic respect from traditional aristocrats who had grown to resent warrior rule, while his reputation for wisdom and piety gave him credibility with the religious establishment that had been so brutally suppressed. Most importantly, his position as son of a retired sovereign provided legal justification for resistance against what he could characterize as usurpation of legitimate authority. Throughout the winter following the heir's death, Mochihito worked carefully to build a network of support that could sustain a serious challenge to the established order. Secret meetings in monastery cells brought together displaced nobles, disaffected religious leaders, and warriors from families that had suffered under harsh policies. The conspiracy that gradually took shape represented a coalition united not by shared ideology, but by common opposition to tyranny. The secret edict that Mochihito issued in the 4th month of 1180 represented one of the most consequential documents in Japanese history. Written in the classical Chinese style that connected him to centuries of literary tradition, the proclamation called upon all loyal subjects to rise against tyranny and restore legitimate rule to the throne. Every character had been carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact, invoking both legal precedent and religious authority to justify what amounted to a call for civil war. The document's distribution required elaborate precautions to avoid surveillance networks that had grown increasingly sophisticated under years of paranoid leadership. Trusted monks carried copies, hidden within the bindings of religious texts, while merchants smuggled them in the bottoms of rice barrels bound for distant provinces. Each copy was handwritten by scribes sworn to secrecy, creating a flood of identical messages that seemed to appear simultaneously throughout Japan. The proclamation's arrival in the eastern provinces, where Minamoto survivors still nursed their grievances, created an explosion of enthusiasm that surprised even its author. Warriors who had been forced into exile or submission saw in the prince's words an opportunity for revenge that carried the blessing of divine authority. Young men who had grown up hearing stories of their family's lost glory suddenly discovered that restoration might be possible within their own lifetimes. In Izu province, a man named Yoritomo read the edict with emotions too complex for simple description. The third son of Yoshitomo, he had spent 20 years in exile, watching his youth pass while dreaming of vengeance against the house that had destroyed his family. Now 33 years old, hardened by years of provincial life, yet still burning with ambition, he recognized that the moment for action had finally arrived. Yet even as rebellion stirred in distant provinces, more immediate dangers threatened the aging patriarch's health and sanity. The strain of maintaining control through increasingly harsh measures had begun to exact a terrible physical toll. Those who attended him in private noted the tremor in his hands, the wild look in his eyes, and the way he would suddenly break off conversations to stare at empty corners of the room, as if seeing phantoms invisible to others. The supernatural manifestations that began to plague him defied rational explanation, yet became increasingly difficult for even skeptics to dismiss. Palace servants reported strange sounds echoing through the corridors at night, the clash of weapons where none should be, the voices of dead enemies calling for vengeance, and the sight of ghostly figures wandering the halls in the distinctive armor of fallen Minamoto warriors. Whether these phenomena existed outside his troubled mind mattered less than their effect on a man already pushed to the edge of madness by guilt and paranoia. His sleep became a battleground where the ghosts of his victims waged nightly warfare against his conscience. Dreams tormented him with visions of burning temples and melting Buddhas, while his waking hours brought hallucinations of his dead son, reproaching him for the path he had chosen. Natural disasters added their own ominous commentary to the political crisis that was engulfing the land. Earthquakes shook the foundations of buildings throughout central Japan with unprecedented frequency and intensity, while unseasonable storms brought destruction to crops and flooding to populated areas. The Great Comet that appeared in the northern sky during the autumn of 1180 blazed with unusual brightness, its fiery tail interpreted by court astronomers as a warning of dynastic change. Even the most skeptical observers began to wonder if heaven itself had withdrawn its mandate from the ruling house. The Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, deeply embedded in Japanese political thought, suggested that natural disasters and social upheaval indicated divine displeasure with current leadership. When such omens coincided with armed rebellion and the appearance of legitimate claimants to authority, they created a powerful narrative that undermined the psychological foundations of established rule. The fever that consumed the aging leader in his final months seemed to burn away whatever remained of his human compassion. Palace physicians found themselves helpless against a condition that appeared to be consuming him from within, his body temperature fluctuating wildly between deadly chills and burning heat that made his skin painful to touch. Delirium brought ravings about enemies closing in from all directions, mixed with lucid moments of crystalline hatred, directed at anyone who dared suggest compromise or retreat. His last recorded words, uttered in the presence of his surviving sons as death approached on the 4th day of the 3rd month of 1181, were curses directed against his enemies and demands that his successor continue the policies that had brought such devastation to the nation. The man who had once shown mercy to a defeated child named Yoritomo died calling for the complete extermination of the Minamoto line, his final breath carrying promises of vengeance that would outlive his own mortality. As cherry blossoms bloomed across a land he had transformed through violence and ambition, the master of the Western House entered his final rest. His death came not in glorious battle, but in the grip of a fever that physicians could neither explain nor cure. His body consumed by an inner fire that seemed to reflect the burning of all he had destroyed. The bells of Gion tolled for the departed patriarch, their bronze voices carrying across a nation where the seeds of civil war had already begun to sprout in soil, watered by 20 years of tyranny and fear. In the eastern provinces, where morning mist clung to mountain valleys, like the spirits of the unquiet dead, a sleeping dragon began to stir. 20 years of exile had transformed a frightened child into a man whose heart burned with the cold fire of patient vengeance. The death of the Tyra patriarch had broken the final chain that bound the surviving Minamoto to their forced submission, and now the son of Yoshitomo prepared to reclaim what had been stolen from his bloodline. The heir's exile in Izu province had been intended as a living death, a perpetual reminder of Minamoto defeat that would serve as an object lesson to any who might consider challenging the established order. Instead, it had become a crucible that forged an iron will from the soft gold of aristocratic privilege. The boy who had once known only the silk-lined chambers of Kyoto palaces now understood the harsh realities of provincial life, the loyalty that could be earned through shared hardship, and the practical skills needed to transform discontent into effective opposition. The man who emerged from 2 decades of obscurity bore little resemblance to the terrified child who had once knelt before his family's executioner. His frame had broadened through years of physical labor and martial training, while his mind had sharpened through careful study of the strategic mistakes that had led to his house's downfall. Unlike his impetuous ancestors, who had relied on noble birth and righteous indignation to carry them to victory, the exiled prince understood that successful rebellion required methodical preparation and strategic patience. His transformation from exile to potential leader had not occurred in isolation. The eastern provinces harbored numerous families whose fortunes had suffered under Tyra dominance, creating a natural constituency for anyone bold enough to challenge the established order. These provincial warriors possessed combat skills, honed through constant conflicts with bandits and raiders, yet they lacked the court connections necessary to advance their interests in the capital. In the Minamoto heir, they recognized a figure who could bridge the gap between local grievances and national ambition. The most crucial of these early supporters was Hojo Tokimasa, a minor provincial lord whose daughter Masako had captured the exile's heart during his years of obscurity. Tokimasa's decision to support his son-in-law's ambitions represented a calculated gamble that the time had come for Eastern interests to assert themselves against Tyra tyranny. His intimate knowledge of local terrain, family connections, and armed resources would prove invaluable in the campaigns that followed. The arrival of Prince Mochihito's secret edict transformed private ambition into public legitimacy. The document provided exactly the legal justification that the Minamoto heir needed to present his rebellion as a restoration of rightful authority rather than mere personal vengeance. When he unfurled the prince's proclamation before an assembly of Eastern warriors, he spoke not as a bitter exile seeking revenge, but as a loyal subject responding to his sovereign's call for assistance against usurpers. The speed with which support materialized surprised even the most optimistic advisors. Warrior families that had maintained careful neutrality for 2 decades suddenly declared their readiness to follow the Minamoto banner into battle. Younger sons who had grown restless under the rigid hierarchy imposed by Taira rule saw opportunity in the coming conflict. Even Buddhist monasteries, outraged by the destruction of Nara, began providing intelligence and material support to the growing opposition movement. Yet the exile's greatest asset lay not in the number of his supporters, but in their quality and motivation. Unlike the comfortable aristocrats who surrounded the Taira leadership in their artificial capital, these Eastern warriors had been hardened by years of frontier life. They understood that survival depended on practical competence rather than ceremonial rank, creating a martial culture that valued effectiveness over elegance. The contrast between Eastern and Taira approaches to warfare became apparent in their respective recruitment strategies. While the established powers relied primarily on conscripted peasants led by court nobles with minimal combat training, the Minamoto built their forces around experienced warriors who had proven themselves in actual battle. His commanders understood the landscape intimately, knew which local families could be trusted, and possessed the tactical flexibility that came from years of fighting irregular conflicts. The first test of this growing movement came sooner than anyone expected. Reports reached the exile that Prince Mochihito himself was fleeing from the capital, pursued by forces loyal to the young sovereign who wore the purple under Taira tutelage. The prince's desperation created both opportunity and obligation. Opportunity to demonstrate Minamoto capabilities, an obligation to protect the royal figure who had legitimized their cause. The Battle of Uji Bridge in the 5th month of 1180 marked the first significant engagement of what would become known as the Genpei War. Though Mochihito's forces ultimately suffered defeat, and the prince himself perished in the fighting, the conflict served notice that the Eastern opposition possessed genuine combat competence. More importantly, the prince's death as a martyr to the cause of legitimate government provided powerful propaganda that strengthened rather than weakened the rebellion. Meanwhile, another Minamoto figure was emerging from obscurity in the mountains of Shinano province. Yoshinaka, cousin to the heir and son of Yoshikata, who had died in earlier conflicts, represented a different model of opposition leadership, where the exile embodied careful planning and strategic sophistication. Yoshinaka exemplified the wild energy of mountain warfare and the charismatic appeal of a natural-born leader who inspired devotion through personal magnetism rather than calculated preparation. Yoshinaka's upbringing among the rough mountain folk of Kiso had created a warrior whose approach to conflict differed dramatically from both the courtly traditions of Kyoto and the methodical preparations favored by his eastern cousin. His followers fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland against foreign occupation, viewing the Taira forces not as fellow Japanese, but as alien invaders who had corrupted the natural order through their cultural pretensions and foreign influences. The emergence of these twin centers of Minamoto opposition created a strategic dilemma for the Taira leadership that their deceased patriarch might have handled more effectively than his inexperienced successors. The new head of the house, Munamori, lacked both the martial genius and the administrative acumen that had enabled his sire to dominate Japanese affairs for 2 decades. His council of advisors, composed primarily of men who had risen through flattery rather than competence, proved incapable of developing coherent responses to the multiple challenges now facing their authority. The decision to divide their forces between multiple fronts represented exactly the kind of strategic error that more experienced leadership might have avoided. Instead of concentrating overwhelming strength against one rebellion, before turning to address the others, they dispatched inadequate forces to suppress each uprising simultaneously. This approach not only diluted their effectiveness, but also provided their enemies with opportunities to achieve local victories that strengthened morale and attracted additional supporters. Religious institutions throughout Japan had watched the destruction of Nara with horror, but they had also taken careful note of the Taira response to organized opposition. The warrior monks who had survived the burning of the great temples understood that their traditional privileges could only be restored through active defiance rather than passive protest. Temple complexes that had previously maintained strict neutrality in factional conflicts began providing sanctuary for rebels, while monastic networks facilitated communication between scattered opposition groups. The Sohei, who emerged from Mount Hiei and other religious centers, brought more than just additional manpower to the growing rebellion. Their deep knowledge of religious law provided legal justification for defiance against rulers who had violated sacred traditions, while their extensive connections throughout the country created intelligence networks that conventional forces could not match. Most importantly, their participation transformed what might have appeared to be mere opportunism into a holy war for the restoration of proper order. The psychological impact of religious participation extended far beyond the monasteries themselves. Ordinary people who had witnessed the systematic persecution of revered institutions began to view the conflict in moral rather than merely factional terms. Stories of miraculous interventions, divine signs favoring the opposition, and supernatural punishments befalling Taira supporters circulated throughout the countryside with the speed and persistence that only genuine popular belief could generate. Economic factors also contributed to the growing instability that undermined Taira authority. The forced relocation to Fukuhara had disrupted established trade patterns while imposing new taxes to fund the construction of an artificial capital. Merchants who had previously prospered under the protection of stable government found themselves subjected to arbitrary confiscations and forced contributions that made normal commercial activity increasingly difficult. The international dimensions of these economic disruptions created additional complications for the beleaguered leadership. Chinese trading partners, concerned about the stability of their Japanese investments, began demanding additional guarantees and higher compensation for the increased risks associated with uncertainty. The revenue streams that had once provided resources for expansion now barely sufficed to maintain existing commitments, forcing difficult choices between competing priorities. Agricultural production, the foundation of all authority in this predominantly rural society, suffered from the combination of natural disasters and human conflict. Peasants who might normally have remained neutral in elite power struggles found themselves directly affected by competing demands for food, labor, and service. The Taira authorities' harsh response to rural opposition created a cycle of repression and rebellion that spread throughout the central provinces. The Minamoto heir's response to these developing opportunities demonstrated the administrative sophistication that would eventually distinguish him from other commanders of his era. Rather than rushing into premature campaigns that might dissipate his growing strength, he focused on building institutional foundations that could sustain long-term opposition. His headquarters at Kamakura became more than just a base. It evolved into an alternative center of government that offered concrete benefits to those who supported the Minamoto cause. The administrative innovations that emerged from this eastern capital reflected hard-learned lessons about the relationship between effective governance and popular support. Unlike the Tyra approach that relied primarily on extraction and coercion, the new government offered protection, justice, and opportunity to those who accepted its authority. Warriors who joined the forces received not just promises of future rewards, but immediate improvements in their status and prospects. Land redistribution became a particularly powerful tool for building loyalty among the provincial warriors who formed the backbone of Minamoto's strength. Holdings confiscated from Tyra supporters were granted to Eastern allies based on merit and service rather than birth or court connections. This policy not only provided material incentives for continued loyalty, but also demonstrated that the new order would operate according to different principles than the old regime. The legal system that developed around Kamakura similarly emphasized practical effectiveness over ceremonial complexity. Disputes were resolved quickly and fairly by judges who understood local conditions rather than court officials whose primary qualification was familiarity with ancient precedents. This approach won support from ordinary people who had grown frustrated with the increasingly arbitrary nature of Tyra justice. Combat organization reflected the same emphasis on practical competence over traditional hierarchy. Command positions were awarded based on demonstrated ability rather than family connections, creating opportunities for capable individuals regardless of their social background. The resulting army possessed a cohesion and effectiveness that forces recruited through conventional methods could not match. As autumn approached in 1180, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically from the desperate circumstances that had faced potential rebels just months earlier. What had begun as scattered protests against Tyra tyranny had evolved into a coordinated opposition movement with multiple centers of strength, clear objectives, and growing popular support. The initiative had passed from the established government to its challengers, creating momentum that would prove increasingly difficult to reverse. The psychological transformation was equally significant. 20 years of unchallenged dominance had created a sense of invincibility among Tyra supporters that the emergence of effective opposition was now systematically undermining. Each successful rebel action, no matter how small, contributed to a growing narrative of decline that became self-reinforcing as former allies began to question their continued loyalty to a cause that no longer seemed certain of victory. Young warriors throughout the country faced choices that would define their entire futures. Sons of families that had prospered under Tyra rule found themselves torn between inherited loyalty and emerging opportunity. The decisions made during these crucial months would determine not only the outcome of the immediate conflict, but also the structure of Japanese society for generations to come. In distant provinces, governors appointed by the central authority began to discover that their orders carried decreasing weight, while reports of Eastern successes multiplied their local difficulties. The elaborate system of centralized control that had seemed so impressive during peacetime proved increasingly inadequate when faced with the distributed challenge of popular opposition. Buddhist concepts of karma and cosmic justice provided a powerful interpretive framework that made sense of these rapid changes for people struggling to understand the collapse of what had seemed like permanent institutions. The wheel of fortune that had elevated the Tyra house to unprecedented heights was now completing its inevitable rotation, carrying them downward with the same inexorable force that had once raised them above their rivals. As winter approached, bringing with it the traditional pause in campaigns, both sides prepared for the larger conflicts that would surely come with spring. The dragon had awakened from its long slumber, and its stirring would soon shake the very foundations of heaven and earth. The age of Tyra dominance was ending, but what would replace it remained to be written in the blood and honor of warriors whose names would echo through the centuries. From the mountain mists of Kurama emerged a figure whose legend would outshine even the greatest heroes of antiquity. While his elder brother built the careful foundations of lasting power in Kamakura, a younger son of Yoshitomo was about to write his name across the heavens in letters of fire and blood. The world would come to know him as Yoshitsune, though the monks who raised him had called him Ushiwakamaru, and his genius for warfare would prove both salvation and doom for those who loved him. The child who had been spirited away to Mount Kurama Temple after his father's death had grown into something unprecedented in the annals of Japanese warfare, a commander whose tactical brilliance bordered on the supernatural. Where other leaders relied on overwhelming numbers or superior equipment, this young man possessed an intuitive understanding of terrain, timing, and the human heart that transformed every battle into a masterpiece of strategic artistry. His very presence on a battlefield could turn certain defeat into miraculous victory, yet this same gift would ultimately make him too dangerous for his own family to tolerate. The mountain temple that sheltered his youth had intended to raise a monk, not a warrior. The abbot Tokaku and his fellow clerics sought to channel the boy's fierce energy into spiritual discipline, hoping that Buddhist teachings might tame the wild blood that flowed through his veins. Instead, they unknowingly created something far more dangerous, a warrior-monk hybrid who combined the tactical flexibility of religious training with the burning ambition of his martial heritage. Legend claimed that the Tengu, those fierce mountain spirits who were said to be the greatest swordsmen in all creation, had taught the boy their secret arts during his solitary wanderings through the temple forests. Whether supernatural instruction or merely exceptional natural talent explained his abilities mattered less than their devastating effectiveness when applied to actual warfare. By the time he reached manhood, few could match his skill with blade or bow, and none could rival his capacity for reading the flow of battle like a scholar interpreting ancient texts. His departure from the monastic life had been as dramatic as everything else about his extraordinary existence. On the night when cherry blossoms fell like snow across the temple grounds, the young man who had been called Ushiwakamaru took his final vows, not to Buddha, but to the memory of his slain father and the restoration of his family's honor. He left behind the brown robes of a novice monk and donned the simple traveling clothes of a wandering warrior, carrying only his swords and an iron determination to join the growing rebellion against the Western House. The journey from Mount Kurama to the northern provinces brought him into contact with Fujiwara no Hidehira, the powerful lord of Mutsu, whose domain in the far north had remained largely independent of central authority. Hidehira recognized both the young man's exceptional abilities and his potential value as a weapon against the regime that threatened northern autonomy. Under Hidehira's protection, the former monk honed his skills further while learning the larger strategies that would transform tactical genius into strategic wisdom. Yet it was not merely martial prowess that distinguished this remarkable figure from other warriors of his generation. During his years in the north, he encountered a warrior monk whose loyalty would become as legendary as his own brilliance. Saito Musashibo Benkei, a giant of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and possessed strength to match his impressive stature, had initially challenged the slight young warrior to single combat on Gojo Bridge in the capital. The duel that followed became one of the most celebrated encounters in Japanese military lore. Benkei, wielding his massive naginata with devastating skill, had never met an opponent who could match his combination of size, strength, and technique. Yet the young heir danced around the giant's attacks like a butterfly evading a charging bull, his smaller blade finding gaps in Benki's defenses that larger weapons could never exploit. When the monk finally acknowledged defeat, he pledged eternal service to a master whose abilities transcended anything he had previously imagined possible. Their partnership created something unprecedented in Japanese warfare, a tactical unit whose effectiveness far exceeded the sum of its individual parts. Benki's imposing presence and unwavering loyalty provided the perfect complement to his master's brilliant but sometimes reckless strategic insights. Where the young commander might pursue victory at any cost, the monk could provide the voice of practical wisdom that prevented genius from becoming suicidal folly. Together, they represented a new model of warrior partnership that would influence military traditions for centuries to come. The call to rejoin his family's cause came in the form of messengers from Kamakura, bearing news of the growing war against the established order. The methodical elder brother, who had built his power base through careful diplomacy and administrative competence, now required the services of a commander who could achieve rapid, decisive victories against enemies whose own strategic position was beginning to crumble. The reunion of the brothers would prove both triumphant and tragic, uniting exceptional talents that complement each other perfectly, while revealing fundamental differences in character that would ultimately tear them apart. The young warrior's arrival at his brother's headquarters created an immediate sensation among the Eastern forces, who had heard whispered stories of his legendary abilities. Here was a figure who embodied everything they admired about the traditional warrior ideal: courage, skill, loyalty, and an almost supernatural capacity for achieving the impossible. Yet he also represented something that made the more thoughtful among them profoundly uneasy, a level of individual brilliance that threatened to overshadow all other considerations, including the patient institution building that his elder brother had pursued. Their first campaign together demonstrated both the promise and the peril of this collaboration. Tasked with eliminating the threat posed by their cousin Yoshinaka, whose wild mountain army had been conducting increasingly independent operations that threatened family unity, the young commander devised a strategy of such audacious simplicity that it seemed almost insane. Rather than engaging in the prolonged siege warfare that conventional wisdom demanded, he would strike directly at Yoshinaka's headquarters through a series of lightning attacks that would give the mountain lord no time to organize effective resistance. The Battle of Owazu in the first month of 1184 showcased the tactical genius, while simultaneously revealing the family tensions that would plague their cause throughout the coming conflicts. Yoshinaka, a charismatic leader whose rough mountain style had won him devoted followers, found himself outmaneuvered by a cousin whose understanding of warfare operated on an entirely different level. The wild energy that had made the mountain lords so effective against their enemies proved insufficient against an opponent who could anticipate and counter every move before it was fully formed. The death of Yoshinaka eliminated a potential rival for leadership of the anti-Western coalition, but it also demonstrated the younger brother's willingness to pursue family interests with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to external enemies. Those who observed the campaign noted that the young warrior showed no apparent regret over the necessity of destroying a kinsman whose only crime had been excessive independence. This capacity for emotional detachment in service of larger strategic objectives would become a defining characteristic of his military career. With internal threats neutralized, the combined forces could turn their attention to the primary objective: the complete destruction of the established power throughout Japan. The enemy's strategic position had deteriorated significantly since the early days of the rebellion, but they still controlled substantial resources and maintained formidable defensive positions that would require exceptional leadership to overcome. The next assignment would provide the ultimate test of tactical innovations against opponents who understood both conventional warfare and the stakes involved in their survival. The assault on Ichinotani fortress in the third month of 1184 would establish the young commander's reputation as the greatest tactical genius of his generation. The stronghold, positioned between mountain cliffs and the sea, had been carefully designed to withstand conventional attacks through its limited approaches. Previous attempts to capture such positions had required months of siege warfare with enormous casualties, making direct assault seem almost suicidal against defenders who enjoyed every possible advantage. Instead of accepting these constraints, the brilliant strategist conceived a plan that ignored conventional limitations entirely. While the main force engaged the enemy's attention through a frontal demonstration, he would lead a select group of mounted warriors down an impossibly steep mountain path that the defenders had considered too dangerous for military use. This rear assault would strike the fortress at its most vulnerable point, while the enemy concentrated their attention on the apparent main attack. The descent down the cliffs of Hiodorigo remains one of the most celebrated feats in military history. Leading 70 mounted warriors down a path so steep that horses could barely maintain their footing, the commander transformed an impossible route into a highway to victory. Local hunters had warned that the trail was too treacherous for military use, yet inspired leadership and exceptional horsemanship turned theoretical impossibility into practical reality. The psychological impact of mounted warriors appearing suddenly within the supposedly impregnable fortress proved even more devastating than the physical damage they inflicted. Defenders who had prepared for conventional siege warfare found themselves facing enemies who seemed to have descended from the sky itself. Panic spread through their ranks as reports of the impossible rear attack created confusion that the frontal assault could exploit. The collapse of Ichinotani marked a turning point in the broader conflict that extended far beyond its immediate strategic consequences. The demonstration that even the strongest positions could be taken through tactical innovation, rather than brute force, undermined the psychological foundations of their defensive strategy. If Ichinotani could fall to such audacious methods, no position in Japan was truly secure against the Eastern assault. Yet the victory also intensified the growing tensions between the brothers, whose different approaches to leadership were becoming increasingly apparent. Where the elder had preferred careful preparation and systematic advance, the younger achieved results through spectacular individual actions that captured popular imagination, while sometimes ignoring larger strategic considerations. The tactical genius's growing fame began to eclipse his brother's more substantial but less dramatic achievements, creating resentments that would prove more dangerous than any external enemy. The pursuit of the defeated forces to their refuge on Shikoku Island provided the stage for another demonstration of tactical brilliance that further enhanced the reputation while deepening fraternal jealousies. The Battle of Yashima in the second month of 1185 showcased not only his military genius, but also his understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare that could be as decisive as physical combat. The famous incident of the fan and the arrow became emblematic of his approach to leadership that combined practical effectiveness with theatrical flair. When a court lady appeared on a ship's deck holding a war fan decorated with the rising sun, enemy warriors challenged the Eastern forces to demonstrate their archery skills by striking the target from the shore. Rather than dismissing this as mere distraction, the commander recognized an opportunity to demonstrate superiority in a way that would resonate throughout both armies. Nasu no Yoichi, a young archer whose skills with the bow had already earned recognition among the forces, accepted the challenge despite the extreme difficulty of hitting such a small target at maximum range while accounting for wind and the movement of both ship and shore. The shot that followed would be remembered for centuries as a perfect fusion of individual skill and inspired leadership, striking the fan from its mount and sending it fluttering into the sea like a dying bird. The psychological impact of this demonstration extended far beyond its immediate entertainment value. Enemy warriors who witnessed the impossible shot understood that they faced opponents whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. Conversely, Eastern forces saw their commander's ability to inspire superhuman achievements in his followers, reinforcing their confidence in ultimate victory regardless of the challenges they might face. Yet even as external victories multiplied, internal tensions continued to escalate between brothers whose fundamental differences in temperament and approach were becoming impossible to reconcile. The famous reverse oars debate that occurred during preparations for the final assault on naval forces revealed the depth of these divisions in ways that no amount of diplomatic courtesy could conceal. The strategic question at issue seemed simple enough. Should their ships be equipped with reverse oars that would allow rapid retreat if the battle turned against them? The elder brothers' representatives argued for such preparations as basic prudence, while the young commander rejected any consideration of retreat as both unnecessary and psychologically damaging to his warriors' morale. The debate revealed fundamentally different philosophies of leadership that made continued cooperation increasingly difficult. Behind the technical arguments lay deeper questions about the nature of command authority and family hierarchy that neither brother could address directly without precipitating an open break. The elder had built his power through careful attention to administrative detail and diplomatic consensus building, while the younger achieved results through personal charisma and tactical brilliance that sometimes bordered on the reckless. Each approach had proven effective in its own sphere, but their combination was creating tensions that threatened to destroy everything both had worked to achieve. The tactical genius's supporters argued that retreat was impossible because victory was certain under his leadership, while his brother's advisors worried that such confidence might lead to unnecessary risks that could jeopardize the entire campaign. The deadlock revealed how success had created its own problems by elevating different models of excellence that could not easily coexist within a single command structure. As spring advanced toward the decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of Japan, the coalition faced its greatest external opportunity alongside its most dangerous internal threat. The enemy forces had been driven to their final refuge, with no remaining hope of avoiding battle. Yet their pursuers were divided by jealousies that could prove as destructive as any enemy action. The stage was set for a climactic encounter that would test not only military prowess, but also the bonds of blood that both united and threatened to tear apart the resurgent house. The cherry blossoms that fell across the encampments of both armies seemed to whisper of impermanence and the fragility of all human achievements. Victory and defeat, loyalty and betrayal, genius and folly, all would soon be tested in the crucible of battle, where individual brilliance must ultimately yield to the inexorable forces that govern the rise and fall of dynasties. The warrior who had learned the arts of war from mountain spirits would soon discover whether supernatural skill could overcome the very human weaknesses that plagued even the most exceptional of mortals. In the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu, where the tide runs swift and treacherous currents dance beneath deceptively calm waters, the final act of a dynastic tragedy was about to unfold. On the 24th day of the third month in the year 1185, two fleets converged upon the waters of Dan no Ura like opposing storm fronts, carrying with them the accumulated hopes, fears, and ambitions of 20 years of civil war. What happened in those turbulent straits would not merely determine the victor in a struggle for political supremacy. It would witness the complete annihilation of one of Japan's most powerful houses, and the drowning of an 8-year-old emperor whose death would haunt the nation's conscience for centuries to come. The remnants of the once mighty Heike had been driven to this final refuge like wild animals fleeing before an unstoppable forest fire. Their great fortress at Ichinotani lay in ruins. Their sacred capital at Fukuhara had been abandoned to enemy occupation, and their attempts to establish new defensive positions on Shikoku had crumbled before the relentless advance of opposing forces. Now, with nowhere left to retreat, they had gathered their surviving ships in the straits that separated the main island from Kyushu, hoping that their superior knowledge of local waters might somehow compensate for their desperate circumstances. The boy emperor Antoku, grandson of the departed patriarch and living symbol of their legitimacy, stood at the center of this final gamble. At 8 years old, he possessed neither understanding of the forces that had shaped his brief life, nor awareness of the catastrophe that was about to engulf him. Yet his very presence aboard the imperial flagship transformed what might have been merely another naval engagement into a battle for the sacred regalia that had legitimized Japanese rule since the mythical age of the gods. The 3 treasures, the sword Kusanagi, the mirror Yata no Kagami, and the jewel Yasakani no Magatama, were more than mere symbols of authority. They represented the divine mandate without which no ruler could claim true legitimacy. The fleet that bore these priceless artifacts reflected the tragic state of a house whose power had once seemed invincible, where hundreds of vessels had once carried their banner across Japanese waters. Fewer than 200 ships now remained to face an enemy whose numerical superiority had grown with each passing month. Many of these surviving vessels showed the scars of previous engagements: patched hulls, makeshift repairs, and the worn appearance of men who had fought too many battles while watching their cause slip inexorably toward defeat. Yet the Heike commanders were far from ready to surrender without a final demonstration of the courage that had originally elevated their house above its rivals. Tomomori, the most capable naval strategist among the surviving leadership, understood that conventional tactics offered no hope against the approaching enemy fleet. Instead, he devised a plan that relied on intimate knowledge of the treacherous currents that swept through the straits with the regularity of clockwork but the unpredictability of living things. The Straits of Dan no Ura had served for centuries as a crucial passage for ships traveling between the inland sea and the waters around Kyushu. Local pilots knew that the tide could change direction 4 times in a single day, creating opportunities for those who understood its patterns while destroying vessels whose captains misjudged its power. Tomomori intended to use this natural phenomenon as a weapon, positioning his forces to take advantage of the tide's flow, while luring his enemies into positions where the current would work against them. As dawn broke over waters that reflected the spring sky like polished bronze, the Genji fleet appeared on the horizon with a magnificence that spoke of absolute confidence in victory. 840 vessels of various sizes carried the banners of the coalition that had methodically destroyed every aspect of Heike resistance over the past 5 years. At their head sailed the ships bearing the tactical genius, whose reputation had grown with each impossible victory, while the vessels flying his elder brother's colours followed in careful formation that demonstrated the organizational skills that had made Eastern success inevitable. The sight of this armada created despair among many loyalists who had witnessed the steady erosion of their cause, but had hoped against hope that some miracle might yet preserve them from complete destruction. The sheer scale of the approaching force made clear that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome such overwhelming numerical superiority in a conventional engagement. Yet there were those among the defenders who welcomed this final confrontation, preferring glorious death to the ignominious survival that defeat would bring. The battle commenced in the early morning hours, when the tide favored the defending forces, allowing their smaller, more maneuverable vessels to exploit their knowledge of local conditions. Tomomori's strategy initially proved effective, as his ships used the current to achieve favorable positions, while avoiding direct confrontations that would have exposed their numerical weakness. For several hours, it seemed possible that tactical skill and geographical advantage might somehow compensate for the enormous disparity in resources. The famous incident involving Nasu no Yoichi and the Fan had established the Genji reputation for impossible achievements, but the opening phases of Dan no Ura demonstrated that their opponents remained formidable adversaries despite their desperate circumstances. Heike archers, fighting with the fury of men defending their emperor and their sacred artifacts, directed devastating volleys against enemy vessels that ventured too close to their defensive formations. Several eastern ships suffered significant damage before their commanders adjusted their tactics to account for the fierce resistance they encountered. Yet the most devastating blow to loyalist hopes came not from enemy action, but from treachery within their own ranks. Taguchi Shigeyoshi, a general whose family had served the house faithfully for generations, made a decision that would transform the course of the battle and seal the fate of everyone aboard the imperial vessels. Whether motivated by calculated self-interest, genuine conviction that continued resistance was futile, or simple panic in the face of overwhelming odds, he ordered his contingent to abandon their assigned positions and join the attacking fleet. The defection created a gap in the defensive formation at precisely the moment when the tide was beginning to turn against the defenders. Genji vessels poured through the breach like water through a crumbling dam, transforming what had been an organized defense into a chaotic melee where individual skill mattered more than coordinated strategy. The tactical advantages that had sustained Heike resistance through the morning hours evaporated as rapidly as morning mist before the rising sun. As the battle entered its final phase, those aboard the Imperial flagship understood that no earthly power could preserve them from the catastrophe that was engulfing their cause. The sacred regalia that had legitimized their authority for 5 years would soon fall into enemy hands unless desperate measures were taken to prevent such desecration. The decision that followed would resonate through Japanese history as one of the most tragic and controversial acts ever committed in the name of imperial dignity. Ninoama, the dowager empress who had devoted her life to preserving the honor of her house and the safety of her imperial grandson, made a choice that would haunt the national conscience for centuries. Rather than allow the sacred treasures and the boy emperor to be captured by enemies who might use them to legitimize their own rule, she chose to commit them all to the purifying embrace of the sea. Taking the 8-year-old Antoku in her arms, she spoke words that would echo through literature and legend. In the depths of the ocean is another capital. The moment when the child emperor disappeared beneath the waves marked not merely the death of an individual, but the drowning of an entire world. With him went the sacred mirror and jewel, divine artifacts whose loss would forever cloud the legitimacy of future rulers. The sword Kusanagi, according to some accounts, had been replaced by a replica before the battle, but the psychological impact of losing the visible symbols of imperial authority could not be diminished by such technicalities. Tomomori, the brilliant naval commander who had orchestrated the Heike resistance to its final moments, chose to follow his emperor into death rather than witness the complete collapse of everything he had fought to preserve. Binding himself with heavy chains to ensure that his body would sink, rather than floating to provide trophies for his enemies, he leaped from his flagship into the dark waters that had become the tomb of imperial legitimacy. The women of the court who had adorned the capital with their beauty and refinement faced their own terrible choices as enemy warriors swarmed aboard the imperial vessels. Many chose to join their emperor in death, rather than endure the humiliation of capture, their brilliantly colored robes blooming like deadly flowers across the surface of the sea before sinking into the depths that had claimed so many other treasures. Lady Tokiko, wife of the departed patriarch and grandmother of the drowned emperor, had watched her family's rise to unprecedented heights and their fall to complete destruction. Her decision to leap into the waves represented more than personal despair. It embodied the recognition that an entire way of life had been swept away by forces too powerful for human resistance. Her death marked the end of the courtly culture that had flourished under their patronage. Yet not all chose the finality of suicide over the uncertainty of survival. Some members of the imperial household were pulled from the water by Genji warriors, whose commanders understood the political value of living prisoners. These survivors, including some of the most refined ladies of the court, would live to see their captors establish new forms of governance, while the world they had known passed into memory and legend. The tactical genius whose brilliance had made this victory possible found himself confronting the aftermath of triumph that exceeded even his own expectations. The complete annihilation of enemy resistance had been achieved more thoroughly than anyone had dared hope. Yet the sight of noble ladies drowning themselves rather than accept capture created troubling questions about the nature of the victory he had won. The same qualities that made him an unparalleled military commander, his ability to pursue objectives with single-minded determination, left him unprepared for the complex emotions generated by total victory. As the sun set over waters stained with blood and littered with the debris of shattered ships, the surviving victors began the grim task of counting the cost of their success. Hundreds of vessels had been destroyed or captured. Thousands of warriors lay dead beneath the waves, and an entire political order had been swept away in a single day of fighting. Yet the implications of what had transpired would extend far beyond the immediate military results. The drowning of the boy emperor created a legitimacy crisis that would plague Japanese politics for decades to come. Without the sacred regalia to validate their authority, future rulers would face constant questions about their divine mandate. The psychological impact of this loss would influence the development of new forms of governance that relied more heavily on military power and administrative efficiency than on sacred symbolism. For the surviving members of the Heike, who had somehow escaped the general catastrophe, the battle marked the beginning of a different kind of ordeal. Exile, imprisonment, or forced retirement to religious life awaited those who had once commanded provinces and directed the affairs of the nation. Their children would grow up bearing the burden of defeat, while their descendants would inherit a legacy of lost grandeur that could never be fully restored. The Genji forces, who celebrated their victory aboard ships still reeking of battle, understood that they had witnessed more than a military triumph. They had participated in the destruction of one world and the birth of another. Yet the full implications of this transformation would only become apparent in the years that followed. The brother whose tactical genius had made victory possible would soon discover that the same brilliance that elevated him above other warriors also made him too dangerous for his own family to tolerate. As night fell over the straits of Dan-no-Ura, carrying with it the ghosts of the drowned and the dreams of the defeated, the tide continued its eternal rhythm of advance and retreat. The waters that had witnessed the final act of a great tragedy would remember the day when cherry blossoms bloomed red upon the waves, and the bells of Gion tolled for an empire that had vanished like smoke dispersed by the wind. The age of the Heike had ended not with gradual decline, but with sudden, absolute extinction. A reminder that even the mightiest of human achievements must ultimately yield to the inexorable forces that govern the rise and fall of all earthly powers. The waters of Dan had drunk deep of noble blood, yet their thirst for tragedy remained unquenched. In the days that followed the great battle, as spring tides carried debris from shattered ships to distant shores, the true cost of total victory began to reveal itself in ways that no military commander could have anticipated. The dead, it seemed, would not rest quietly beneath the waves, while the living discovered that survival carried burdens heavier than any warrior's armor. Among those pulled from the crimson waters was a figure whose very existence embodied the moral complexities that now confronted the victorious forces. Chulainn, younger brother of the departed patriarch and architect of the Nara temple, burning that had so horrified the Buddhist world, found himself a prisoner whose capture created as many problems as it solved. Here was a man whose military skills had once struck terror into the hearts of his enemies, yet whose actions against sacred institutions had marked him as a criminal against heaven itself. The warrior who had commanded the destruction of Todaiji Temple now knelt in chains before his captors, his once proud bearing reduced to the humble posture of a defeated enemy. Yet those who observed him closely noted something unexpected in his demeanor, not the defiant rage of an unrepentant soldier, but the profound sorrow of a man who had begun to comprehend the true magnitude of what he had destroyed. The flames that had consumed ancient treasures had apparently kindled a different kind of fire within his own soul. During the long months of his captivity, Chulainn underwent a transformation that astonished even his guards. The man who had once shown no mercy to monks pleading for their sacred artifacts now spent his days in meditation and prayer, seeking forgiveness for crimes that had seemed justified during the heat of factional warfare. His letters to family members, intercepted and read by his captors, revealed a depth of spiritual anguish that transformed him from a symbol of military brutality into something approaching a figure of tragic dignity. The question of what to do with such a prisoner created unprecedented dilemmas for the new rulers of Japan. Buddhist institutions throughout the country demanded his execution as justice for the irreplaceable treasures he had destroyed, while political considerations suggested that showing mercy might demonstrate the magnanimity befitting victorious leaders. The debate that raged within government councils revealed fundamental tensions about the nature of justice, forgiveness, and the proper relationship between secular and religious authority. The solution that eventually emerged satisfied no one completely, while highlighting the complex moral landscape that now defined Japanese society. Chulainn would be handed over to the monks of Nara for judgment, acknowledging the special nature of his crimes against religious institutions, while avoiding the appearance of purely political execution. Yet this decision, intended to demonstrate respect for Buddhist law, would ultimately produce a tragedy that haunted all who witnessed it. The journey to Nara became a pilgrimage of sorts, as the former general was transported through countryside, where his name had once inspired fear, but now evoked complex emotions among those who lined the roads to observe his passage. Some came seeking vengeance for the suffering his actions had caused, while others found themselves moved by the obvious sincerity of his repentance. The contrast between the arrogant warrior who had ordered temples burned and the broken man who now accepted responsibility for his actions created a powerful reminder of karma's inexorable operations. At Nara itself, Among the ruins of the great temple complex that his orders had reduced to ashes, Shigehira faced the surviving monks whose brothers he had killed and whose treasures he had destroyed. The confrontation that followed transcended simple questions of crime and punishment, becoming instead a profound exploration of Buddhist concepts of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of spiritual transformation, even among those who had committed the most terrible acts. The monks' decision to proceed with execution, despite clear evidence of the prisoner's genuine repentance, reflected their understanding that some actions carry consequences that transcend individual remorse. The sacred artifacts that had been lost could never be recovered. The murdered brothers would never return to life, and the cultural treasures that had taken centuries to create had been reduced to ashes in a single night. Justice demanded acknowledgement that certain violations of the sacred order required ultimate punishment regardless of subsequent spiritual awakening. Yet even as Shigehira prepared for death, his final days produced some of the most moving poetry in Japanese literature. His verses, composed while facing execution, revealed a man who had achieved profound understanding of the Buddhist teachings he had once scorned. The irony was not lost on observers that the destroyer of temples had become, in his final months, a more genuine practitioner of Buddhist wisdom than many who had never lifted a sword against religious institutions. His execution in the summer of 1185 marked more than the death of an individual warrior. It symbolized the end of an era when military power could be exercised without regard for moral consequences. The new order that was emerging from the ashes of civil war would need to grapple with questions of justice and mercy that had been largely ignored during the desperate struggles for survival that had characterized the previous decades. Meanwhile, supernatural manifestations began appearing throughout the regions where major battles had been fought, creating a parallel narrative of ghostly unrest that seemed to mirror the political upheavals transforming Japan. Fishermen working the waters near Dan no Ura reported strange lights beneath the waves and the sound of battle drums echoing from the depths during the darkest hours of night. Some claimed to see phantom ships sailing across waters that reflected no earthly vessel, while others spoke of hearing the voices of drowned warriors calling out the names of comrades who had preceded them into death. The most persistent of these supernatural reports concerned the appearance of warrior spirits at the sites of former battles, particularly around Ichinotani, where the spectacular cliff descent had marked the beginning of the end for Heike resistance. Local residents described encounters with ghostly figures in armor, some identifiable as specific warriors who had died in the fighting, others appearing as anonymous spirits whose only common characteristic was the profound sadness that emanated from their spectral forms. These manifestations were not dismissed as mere peasant superstitions by educated observers who understood their significance within Buddhist cosmology. The concept of hungry ghosts, spirits trapped between life and death by the intensity of their attachments to worldly concerns, provided a framework for understanding why the violent deaths of so many warriors might produce lingering spiritual disturbances. The very intensity of the emotions that had driven men to fight and die for their causes now prevented their souls from finding the peace that should follow death. The most tragic of these ghostly appearances involved the spirit of the child emperor Antoku, whose drowning had created a wound in the national psyche that would never fully heal. Witnesses reported seeing a small figure in imperial robes standing at the water's edge near Dan no Ura, always at twilight when the boundary between day and night mirrored the liminal space between life and death. The apparition never spoke, but its presence served as a constant reminder of the innocent life that had been sacrificed to adult ambitions and political necessities. These supernatural phenomena reached their most dramatic expression in the fate of the tactician, whose brilliance had made victory possible, but whose very success had planted the seeds of his own destruction. As the months following Dan no Ura passed, the relationship between the brothers, whose collaboration had seemed so perfect, began to deteriorate with a speed that shocked even those who had anticipated eventual tensions. The problem lay not in any failure of military or administrative competence, but in the very success that had made the younger brother indispensable to victory, yet dangerous to the new political order that victory had created. His fame among ordinary warriors threatened to overshadow the careful institution building that his elder had pursued, while his obvious superiority in tactical matters created awkward questions about the distribution of authority within the family hierarchy. The reverse oars debate that had revealed fundamental differences in approach during the preparation for Dan no Ura now seemed prophetic in its exposure of incompatible philosophies of leadership. Where the elder brother sought to build lasting institutions that could survive individual personalities, the younger had achieved results through personal charisma and tactical brilliance that could not easily be transferred to others or integrated into bureaucratic structures. The crisis that would destroy their partnership emerged from the intersection of personal jealousy with political necessity. Reports reached Kamakura that the tactical genius was being approached by former enemies seeking to exploit any divisions within the victorious coalition, while his own supporters began suggesting that his military achievements entitled him to greater recognition than his current position provided. Whether these reports reflected genuine conspiracies or merely the inevitable rumors that surround any successful military leader mattered less than their effect on a relationship already strained by fundamental differences in temperament. The elder brother's response revealed both the calculating intelligence that had made him an effective political leader and the personal insecurities that success had failed to eliminate. Rather than confronting the situation directly through family discussion, he chose to address it through the institutional mechanisms he had created, issuing orders that effectively placed his younger brother under house arrest while investigating allegations of disloyalty that everyone understood to be pretexts for eliminating a potential rival. The transformation of brotherhood into enmity proceeded with the inexorable logic of Greek tragedy, as each brother's greatest strengths became the source of conflict with the other. The elder's talent for systematic organization, so crucial to building lasting political institutions, made him sensitive to any challenge to established hierarchy. The younger's gift for inspiring personal loyalty, essential to his battlefield success, inevitably created networks of devotion that existed outside formal command structures. The pursuit that followed the younger brother's flight from Kamakura demonstrated that even the most exceptional military talents could not overcome the systematic resources of an organized state. Fujiwara no Yasuhira, the northern lord who had once provided sanctuary during the years of exile, now faced impossible choices between loyalty to a former protege and submission to the new national authority that demanded his surrender. The betrayal that ended the career of Japan's greatest tactical genius came not through dramatic battlefield confrontation, but through the quiet treachery of political calculation. Yasuhira's decision to order the attack on his guest's residence at Koromagawa represented the triumph of practical considerations over personal honor, demonstrating how completely the old world of individual loyalty had given way to the new reality of institutional power. The final moments of the warrior genius, who had seemed capable of achieving any victory, revealed both the limitations of individual brilliance and the profound tragedy of talents turned against themselves. Surrounded in a residence that could not be defended against overwhelming numbers, faced with certain death or capture that would bring dishonor to all who had served him, he chose the path that preserved his dignity while ensuring that his legend would outlive his physical existence. The ritual suicide that ended his life on the 30th day of the fourth month in 1189 was conducted with the same attention to perfect form that had characterized his approach to military tactics. Every detail was arranged to create maximum psychological impact, while denying his enemies any opportunity to claim that fear or desperation had influenced his final decisions. His death became a masterpiece of controlled action that transformed defeat into a different kind of victory. Benki's final stand in defense of his master created one of the most enduring images in Japanese military lore. The giant monk, who had pledged eternal service during their first encounter on Gojo Bridge, now demonstrated the ultimate meaning of such devotion by fighting to the death against impossible odds. His body, found standing upright, with multiple arrows protruding from his armor, became a symbol of loyalty that transcended life itself. The head that was sent to Kamakura as proof of the mission's success carried with it implications that extended far beyond the elimination of a single individual. The elder brother, who received this grisly trophy, had achieved his immediate objective of removing a potential threat to his authority, yet the cost of this victory would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The bonds of blood that had once united the family in common cause had been severed by political necessity, creating wounds that no amount of success could heal. As news of the tragedy spread throughout Japan, many who had witnessed the brilliant campaigns of recent years understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. The age of individual heroism that had characterized the Civil War period was giving way to a new era of institutional governance, where personal loyalty must yield to systematic authority. The death of the tactical genius marked not merely the end of a remarkable life, but the conclusion of an entire phase of Japanese military culture. The ghosts that were said to haunt the sites of recent battles now gained a new member whose spiritual presence would prove more enduring than his physical existence had been. At Koromogawa, where his blood had watered the earth that would nurture countless future legends, witnesses reported seeing a warrior in full armor practicing sword techniques beneath the moonlight. The spirit of Japan's greatest military genius had apparently found in death the peace that life had ultimately denied him. Though his legend would continue to inspire warriors and poets for centuries to come, in the years that followed the great catastrophe at Dan no Ura, when the cherry blossoms bloomed over graves both old and new, a different kind of immortality began to take shape for those whose earthly power had been swept away by the tides of war. The voices that had once commanded armies and directed the affairs of state had been forever silenced, yet paradoxically, these same voices would speak across the centuries through stories that transformed historical tragedy into eternal art. The tale of their rise and fall would become something far greater than the sum of its individual tragedies, a mirror in which future generations would glimpse the fundamental truths about human ambition, divine justice, and the impermanence that governs all earthly existence. The first bearers of this emerging legend were wandering monks whose blindness had opened their inner vision to truths that sighted men often missed. These biwa hoshi, carrying their four-stringed lutes across the highways and waterways of Japan, possessed something more precious than gold or silver. They carried the living memory of a world that had passed away, transformed into music that could make the dead speak and the ancient passions burn bright in contemporary hearts. Their art represented a revolutionary development in Japanese culture, creating a form of historical preservation that relied not on written documents locked away in aristocratic libraries, but on oral performance that could reach any audience willing to listen. The biwa itself, that teardrop-shaped instrument whose strings could weep like a mourning woman, or thunder like charging cavalry, had been imported from China centuries earlier, along with the Buddhist teachings that provided the philosophical framework for understanding the tragic events it would commemorate. Yet in the hands of these itinerant storytellers, the foreign instrument became thoroughly Japanese, its voice perfectly suited to expressing the complex emotions that the tale demanded. The plucked strings could evoke the clash of swords at Ichinotani, the splash of oars at Yashima, or the whisper of silk sleeves brushing against palace corridors where power once resided. These musical chroniclers operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from the scholarly historians who recorded events for posterity in dusty court archives. Where academic writers sought factual accuracy and political analysis, the blind monks pursued emotional truth and spiritual instruction. Their goal was not merely to preserve what had happened, but to illuminate why it mattered for audiences who had never witnessed the splendor of Fukuhara or felt the earth tremble beneath the hooves of charging war horses. They transformed individual tragedies into universal truths, making the fall of the Heike relevant to farmers and merchants, soldiers and priests, anyone who had ever wondered about the meaning of success and failure in human affairs. The process by which historical events became artistic legend involved countless retellings, each performance adding subtle variations that gradually shaped raw events into polished narrative. Stories that began as eyewitness accounts of specific battles evolved through countless performances into carefully structured dramas that highlighted particular themes while subordinating mere factual detail to larger truths about human nature and cosmic justice. The result was something unprecedented in world literature, a historical epic that achieved the universality of myth while retaining the emotional immediacy of personal testimony. The most gifted of these musical storytellers developed signature passages that audiences would travel great distances to hear, creating a competitive environment that encouraged constant refinement of both musical and narrative techniques. A master performer might spend decades perfecting his rendition of Antoku's Drowning or Yoshitsune's Final Battle, experimenting with subtle changes in tempo, melody, and verbal emphasis, until he achieved effects that could reduce grown warriors to tears or inspire young men to dedicate their lives to martial training. The audiences that gathered to hear these performances represented a cross-section of Japanese society unprecedented in earlier cultural forms. Buddhist temples provided venues where social distinctions temporarily dissolved as aristocrats and commoners shared the same benches, united by their fascination with tales that spoke to universal human experiences. The democratizing effect of this art form helped spread cultural knowledge that had previously been confined to court circles, while simultaneously creating new forms of national identity based on shared narrative rather than mere political allegiance. Women played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting these stories, though their contributions often went unrecognized in official records dominated by male perspectives. Aristocratic ladies who had survived the various catastrophes of the Civil War period possessed intimate knowledge of court life that enriched the stories with authentic details about clothing, ceremonies, and personal relationships. Their memories of how silk felt against skin, how incense smelled in autumn gardens, or how moonlight looked filtering through palace screens provided the sensual specificity that transformed abstract historical accounts into vivid human experiences. Servants and attendants who had witnessed dramatic events from positions that made them invisible to their social superiors often possessed the most accurate memories of what had actually happened during crucial moments. Their perspectives, incorporated into the evolving narratives through informal conversations and chance encounters with performing monks, ensured that the stories retained connection to lived experience rather than becoming purely fictional constructs. The Buddhist framework that shaped the interpretation of these historical events provided more than just religious coloring. It offered a comprehensive worldview that could make sense of apparently senseless tragedy. The concept of mujo, usually translated as impermanence but encompassing a much richer cluster of ideas about the transitory nature of all phenomena, gave audiences a way to understand why even the mightiest houses must eventually fall, and why the most brilliant individuals must ultimately face defeat and death. This philosophical perspective transformed what might have been merely depressing stories about political failure into profound meditations on the nature of existence itself. The fall of the Heike became a demonstration of universal principles rather than an isolated historical accident, making their tragedy meaningful for people who had never encountered aristocratic court life, but who understood from personal experience the ways in which human ambitions inevitably exceed human capabilities. The doctrine of karma provided another essential interpretive framework, offering explanations for why particular individuals suffered specific fates, while suggesting that apparent injustices might reflect causes extending beyond immediate circumstances. Shigehira's execution could be understood as the inevitable result of his destruction of sacred temples, while Yoshitsune's betrayal by his own brother illustrated how even virtuous actions might produce unfortunate consequences when performed from impure motives. Yet the Buddhist interpretation of these events was neither simplistic nor morally judgmental in ways that modern audiences might expect. The tradition emphasized compassion for all beings caught in the web of karmic causation, recognizing that even those who committed terrible acts were themselves victims of ignorance and passion rather than pure evil. This perspective allowed the stories to maintain sympathy for tragic figures while acknowledging the reality of moral consequences, creating narratives of remarkable psychological complexity. Regional variations in how these stories were told reflected local concerns and cultural emphases while maintaining the essential narrative structure that gave the overall saga its unity. Performances in areas where specific battles had been fought often included additional details about local terrain and personalities, while audiences in regions that had supported different factions heard versions that emphasized different aspects of the moral lessons involved. The gradual spread of these stories throughout Japan created something approaching a national literature for the first time in the country's history. Previous cultural forms had been largely confined to court circles or specific religious communities, but the Heike tales reached audiences in the most remote provinces and the humblest social circumstances. This broad cultural penetration helped establish narrative patterns and aesthetic values that would influence Japanese literature for centuries to come. The transition from oral performance to written literature began in the late Kamakura period, as scholars recognized the artistic and historical value of preserving these stories in more permanent form. Yet the process of converting musical narrative into written text presented unprecedented challenges, since so much of the original art form's impact depended on elements that could not be captured in written characters: the performer's voice, the instrument's sound, the audience's response, and the specific circumstances of each performance. Early written versions attempted to preserve some aspects of the oral tradition by including musical notations and performance instructions, but these technical supplements could never fully capture the living quality that made the original performances so powerful. The result was a new literary form that combined some characteristics of drama, epic poetry, and historical chronicle, while remaining distinct from all three. The influence of these written versions extended far beyond literature into other art forms that drew inspiration from the stories and characters they preserved. No drama developed during the Muromachi period transformed selected episodes from the Heike cycle into highly stylized theatrical performances that emphasized the spiritual and psychological dimensions of the original narratives. The masked actors, who portrayed tragic figures like Atsumori or Taira no Kiyotsune, created visual representations of transcendent sorrow that complemented the verbal artistry of the original stories. Kabuki theatre, appealing to broader audiences with its more naturalistic style and spectacular staging effects, adapted Heike's stories in ways that emphasized their dramatic and emotional content. The famous scene of Yoshitsune and Benkei on Gojo Bridge became a standard showcase for actors demonstrating their physical and emotional range, while the drowning of Antoku provided opportunities for spectacular stage effects that brought tears to audiences centuries removed from the original events. Visual arts, including painting, sculpture, and decorative crafts, drew extensively on Heike imagery to create works that translated narrative content into static visual form. Screen paintings depicting the Battle of Ichinotani allowed viewers to contemplate the tactical brilliance of the cliff descent at leisure, while portraits of individual heroes and heroines preserved idealized images of beauty and courage that became cultural standards for future generations. The influence of Heike stories on Japanese concepts of heroism, loyalty, and honor cannot be overstated. The examples set by figures like Benkei, Yoshitsune, and even Antoku provided models of behavior that shaped ideals of masculine and feminine virtue for centuries to come. Young samurai learned to measure themselves against these legendary standards, while women found in characters like Lady Tokiko examples of dignity maintained under impossible circumstances. Yet the stories also provided cautionary examples of how virtue could become vice when pursued without wisdom or moderation. Kiyomori's transformation from loyal retainer to tyrannical despot illustrated the corrupting effects of unchecked power, while the fraternal conflict between Yoritomo and Yoshitsune demonstrated how family bonds could be destroyed by political ambition and personal jealousy. Modern adaptations of Heike stories in film, television, manga, and anime have introduced these ancient narratives to audiences worldwide while adapting their themes to contemporary concerns. Directors like Akira Kurosawa found in the Civil War period rich material for exploring universal themes about power, loyalty, and moral ambiguity, while popular culture has embraced characters like Yoshitsune as symbols of tragic heroism that transcend cultural boundaries. The enduring appeal of these stories reflects their success in addressing fundamental questions about human nature that remain relevant regardless of historical period or cultural context. Why do the powerful inevitably fall? How should individuals balance personal loyalty against larger principles? What meaning can be found in suffering and loss? These questions, posed initially by 12th century events, continue to resonate with audiences facing their own versions of the same eternal dilemmas. The bells of Gion, whose sound opened this ancient tale, continue to toll across the centuries, their bronze voices carrying messages that grow deeper and richer with each generation that discovers their meaning. They speak of cherry blossoms that bloom and fall in endless cycles, of human pride that rises like morning mist only to vanish before the heat of noon, and of stories that achieve the immortality denied to the flesh and blood individuals who inspired them. In the end, the greatest victory of the Heike was not any military triumph or political achievement accomplished during their brief ascendancy, but rather the transformation of their defeat into art that would outlast bronze and stone. Their names live on, not carved in monuments that weather and crumble, but sung in voices that pass their music from generation to generation, like sacred flames that can never be extinguished. The sound of the Gion Shoja bells echoes the impermanence of all things, yet paradoxically ensures that some things, the things that matter most, endure forever in the memory of the human heart.